to Bank B. So now this is the same size as this again. And this is the same size as this. And that's all that needs to happen if Bank A is not worried about the fact its reserves are now low. If Bank A is concerned about its reserves being lower, it can try to A, so we just draw up again. So there's the lower reserves. There's our new loan up there. And this is just liabilities on the bank and the capital. What could happen is that this bank could simply attract new deposits off the general public and then put that money in its reserve account at the Bank of England to re-establish its reserves. So that's one solution. A separate solution is that there's the lower reserves. Remember, this is liabilities and assets. Our bank can borrow some money from the central bank, so loan from central bank, and it can put that money in its reserves to increase its reserves. Now the final option is, and the one which I think is most commonly actually taken by banks, is that, and I'll go back to this diagram, because it'll be simpler to do it with this diagram. That Bank B simply lends the reserves back to Bank A, creating a liability. So this is like, in a sense, borrow from B. This is the reserves which are borrowed. And this simply changes this from being reserves to being loan to A. And that's an asset to this bank. So your three options, unless I got it wrong. Now obviously what happens is that we've got lots of different banks. So one day Bank A will be making more loans than Bank B and end up probably owing money to Bank B. Another day Bank B will be making more loans than Bank A and will end up owing money to Bank A. If all of the banks are making new loans, it might be that all of the new loans go around and circulate around the system between deposit holders, so it turns out that everything balances between the banks. So none of the banks need to do anything about it because it just balances out in clearing. Yeah?
Then how can a bank die? Can banks go bankrupt then?
Of course they can.
Looking at this, it looks like even if they issue new loans or they sell loans, it still balances anyway. So how then can a
Bank die.
bank die? Basically.
See, there is no discussion about the death of banks in this article, right?
Yeah.
Because that's not the subject. Right? The subject of this article is money creation. Right? Where it's explained how banks can die, right, is when we were like doing it last year. Okay? Now let me I'll just leave that on the board and let's like have a bank dying now.
Nick, I've got a question. You know, with the third one, you're saying that there's an IOU, so they transfer the reserves to pay it back, and then they borrow it back, they end up with an IOU. Why don't they just keep it in the first place that they owe the money?
Well, this one,
Yeah.
well, look, when it's reserves, right, okay, it's being held at the Bank of England, right?
Yeah.
Okay? The Bank of England will say, pay, I don't know, for the sake of argument, 1% interest. Now, the only reason that they would lend it back to Bank A is if they could get 1.5% interest.
Right.
And it creates a hierarchy of interest rates. The lowest interest rate in the financial system, right? The lowest interest rate in the financial system is the interest rate which the Bank of England pays on reserves.
Reserve is full of loans then.
But that's not actually the lowest interest rate in the banking system, right? The lowest interest rate in the banking system is the rate of interest you will get on your
Why is it?
savings.
Oh, there's no arrow to it. It's just like a line. Oh, reserve
Right.
too long.
So the lowest interest rate is as a saver what you'll get from your bank if you're not giving up any access, right? The next lowest interest rate is the interest rate the Bank of England will pay on the reserves. And then you've got the interest rate, which is the interbank rate for loans between banks, which will be slightly above what the Bank of England pays. And then higher, you'd get the interest rates that the bank will charge you to borrow money. That's the hierarchy of interest rates.
So that's why they do it, so they get a better rate. So.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's face it. Why would a bank borrow from another bank? You know, why would a bank lend to another bank money which it can get a higher interest rate for keeping it in its reserves?
Nick, I don't get this picture. Like, if you could, I don't know if you could summarize it, or I don't understand. I can understand the other one, to the bank goes to central bank.
Alright, we'll go back to that in a minute, alright?
No.
We'll give it another go.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do was I wanted to answer like his point at the back about a bank dying. Right, so let's just get that done out of the way so we're not confused by that. Right, so like, here's a diagram, right, for a bank. The deposits it owes is the money which the bank owes to people who put money in the bank. The capital is the money which has come into the bank either through selling shares in itself or through making a profit and keeping hold of that profit in the past, not passing it to the shareholders. Right? The capital is the only money here which the bank has which it can absorb losses. Right? Let's say that these loans here go bad and nobody's ever going to pay them back. Right? Then the amount of loans this bank's going to write off, which is never coming back, is now bigger than the capital it can write off loans, so it goes bankrupt and dies. That's what kills a bank. What kills a bank is the assets, the loans, ceasing to exist. Right? Now, That's a solvency crisis killing a bank. Now also, what will cause the bank severe problems is if it's like, if suddenly everybody, so just ignore that and assume all these loans are fine, right? If everybody wants to take their money out of the bank, right, then they've only got this much reserves to pay the money. So conceivably, they might not be able to swap these loans into money quick, so they might become insolvent because they can't pay out. But this bank in that situation could swap the loans, in essence, with the central bank for enough reserves to make that not a possibility. Or it could simply, so essentially, there is no reason if the central bank is stepping in and providing liquidity, right, appropriately for any bank to go under just because it's in liquidity crisis. And you look at Northern Rock, it didn't go under because of a liquidity crisis. Northern Rock ultimately, should we leave them outside? Northern Rock ultimately went under because it had loans which people weren't going to pay back. Right, let's have another go at, so it's this one, isn't it? Like, Reza? What's this one?
Yes.
Alright, but let's it's being a bit like a magician. At no point will the hands leave the end of my arms. Let's try it again.
Because I think you have no option. Because you said that's the most common way. You said the last word is the most common way of the banks of doing it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The banks want more money from interest. If they just said, I don't know about it, we'll keep the loan, but they won't be paid, and if the bank has to buy it back, they can charge more.
Why? Is it because they have no other option, or?
No, it's just it's like easy to do it that way,
Oh, yeah,
like it's normally hard to suddenly attract people to put money in your bank, right? And normally you avoid dealing directly with the central bank because if you borrow money from the central bank, it might be an indication of your bank's weakness.
Yeah.
So this
They'd rather pay the interest rate and
so this leads you to want to deal with the other banks instead.
It's easier, yeah.
All right. Now let's see if we can do this. So we're now going to have in a different colour. We're going to have the new loan, and we're going to have the new deposit. And here is this bank, and it's got this many reserves. And that's Bank B, and that's Bank A. So are you happy with the initial situation? Right. Next step. The new deposit ends up in Bank B because the people who own it buy things off of people in the different banks. To match this bank has got to transfer reserves to this bank to match the situation. Now if that's all that happens, then what we'll be left with, and let's put blue around it, if that's all that happens, then this is the total amount of assets of this bank, and this is the total amount of liabilities of this bank, and the two will match. So if this bank's happy just to function on this lower amount of reserves, that's fine. So let's now draw here a a situation So what I've done, right, is I've drawn down here exactly that, right? And I've drawn over here the blue bits here, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Now what I'm saying is, and this bank's already got those reserves, which is keeping it with the Bank of England. What I'm saying is, if this bank takes the asset of these reserves, right, and lends them to this bank can now have more reserves.
Yeah.
This changes the reserves into a loan to A. Right? This creates a new liability on this bank of loan to B. You can now see how this stays the same. And here, both the liabilities, because there's a new loan to B, and the extra reserves which have arrived, extend this block back to like the height it was before.
You mean loan from B, the second bit down, like loan from he borrowed from the bank.
So you
Loan
Yes.
belong to
from B.
Or it's actually loan to A.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's loan to A.
Okay. Yeah. Just
That's-
put it the same name. Okay.
Or like that's, well, even better, we might well just say O B.
OB.
O B. So what happens is that the banking system merrily keeps on making loans according to what the demand for those loans is at the current interest rate. If they make risky loans and too many loans, they'll end up becoming bad loans, which they have to write off against capital, and if they don't have enough capital, they'll become insolvent and have to seek an injection of capital from either new shareholders or from the government. If at any stage they face a liquidity crisis in the sense of needing more reserves to either hold themselves or to transfer to another bank, then the bank will either attract more money deposits from the public, or they'll borrow it from the central bank, or they'll borrow it from another bank in the interbank market. What the interbank market is doing is it's redistributing reserves between banks. It allows some banks to grow their loan book fast in the knowledge that when this leads to them having to transfer money to other banks, they can essentially borrow that money back. the whole process of issuing loans will continue to be profitable as long as the interest rate you're charging on those loans is higher than the interest rate you would pay to have to borrow reserves from the Bank of England or to borrow those reserves from another bank. Normally, the interest rate on loans is boosted additionally higher by the fact that it's going to cover a certain amount of write-off of bad debt, so the bank doesn't have to dip into its capital all the time. The fees and interest paid on loans, right, will accumulate in the bank, and until they're potentially paid to shareholders of the bank, will simply increase the bank's capital. What these diagrams are not showing very clearly is this process of interest being paid. Now, I've never seen a diagram which does this and accounts for the payment of interest. Just off the top of my head, I'm not sure how I would draw one. It's got to be possible. But you see the things illustrated separately. You see what I mean? You don't see it all put together. But again, like when I read something like this, right? Okay, when I read something like this, I'm trying to notice what they're not talking about. Because what they're not talking about might be very illustrative of what's important. Now, obviously, I wouldn't expect you to do the same, because I'm more experienced at reading this sort of thing than you. But if you were, say, like not third-year undergraduate students, say that you were a PhD student, right? Then I would be expecting you to like interrogate it for what's not written in it, which you'd be able to do because you've done a wider reading. You see what I'm saying? So everything's relative. Now, there doesn't appear to be tremendous discussion of interest in here. There is some discussion, but it's not a central feature. So that interests me. Now, when it comes to talking about quantitative easing, right, which is the last couple of pages, the focus of the discussion is saying, well, look, quantitative easing does not give banks free money. Quantitative easing does not give banks money to lend. They're the 2 points which they're trying to address in the article. And they basically follow from a lot of criticism that the Bank of England would have had when it conducted quantitative easing, saying to them, look, you're giving banks free money, and the banks can lend this money. Look what's going to happen. Now, anybody who believes in the traditional money multiplier says, oh, look, you're giving banks base money, they're going to lend more money. So here, that article wants to focus on saying, no, that's not true, because banks don't need money to lend. Money's created when they lend. So it couldn't be true. There's no way that giving banks more money through quantitative easing, essentially, could lead to banks directly lending that money because they don't need the money to lend, because they would create money from nowhere by lending anyway, so they don't need any. So that is one of the points I want to make on quantitative easing. Now on the point about free money, what they point out there is that when the Bank of England buys a government bond from, say, an insurance company, the insurance company puts the money into its bank account at a bank and expects to be paid interest on it. So the money which arrives at the bank as a deposit from the insurance company, the bank has to pay interest on it. Now they take that money which has arrived into the bank and they put it in the Bank of England reserve account, which also pays interest. So the bank, which is essentially receiving from the insurance company an amount of money which it now owes the insurance company, is receiving interest on that money as it sits in the Bank of England. But it's having to pay interest to the insurance company in recognition that the money is the insurance company's money. Now obviously, if the bank can get away with giving the insurance company a lower interest rate than what it gets from the Bank of England, it is making money on it, isn't it? I mean, if like you give me £1 billion and I pay you 1% on it, and I lend it to him and he gives me 2%, I'm profiting from the difference, aren't I? So the argument used by the Bank of England to say it's not free money is a weak argument, because if the interest rates are different, then it is a subsidised way of banks being able to make money. Now, when the banks were desperately making losses in the financial crisis, a sneaky way of giving them something to do which they could make profit from was quite a helpful thing to do, when you think about it. But do you want to say that in your publication? Not really. Not really. So they don't. Now the biggest thing missing from what's written in that article when it talks about quantitative easing is this. Well, let's just, like before we say what's missing, let's say how they think quantitative easing is supposed to help the economy. This is what they say. They say, well, look, government buys bond back from an insurance company. The bond ends up being owned now by the government. The insurance company's now got money. The insurance company, if it now uses that money to buy something, then it will increase demand in the economy if they're buying something real. Okay, the insurance company's not likely to buy anything. So if the insurance company uses that money to lend to another organisation, so say the insurance company, what it does is that it sells government bonds to the government, gets money in return, uses that money to buy corporate bonds from businesses, then you could argue that the exercise is leading to the insurance company now effectively lending money to business which might make business expand. So this is the route by which the Bank of England's hoping that quantitative easing will improve the economic situation, because they hope that the financial institutions who sell them bonds will use their money to invest in businesses which will expand production. That's what they want to happen. It does make you wonder why the government didn't simply ask the Bank of England to buy corporate bonds directly from the companies involved, doesn't it? Why go on this circular route of having to buy one type of bond from an insurance company and then hope the insurance company buys a different type of bond from somebody else? That seems to be a very vague way of doing this, when there's nothing stopping the government telling the Bank of England to buy the corporate bonds of firms direct. So immediately you ask the question, well, if you're going on a roundabout route, why? Now the answer to that question's got to be there's only two possible answers as far as I can see. One is that you're embarrassed as a government to have your central bank directly lend money to business because you think that's going to look irresponsible. And secondly, I think the real argument underneath all of this is, what if all of this is just rubbish anyway? And your true motivation in doing quantitative easing is simply to increase the demand for UK government bonds? When you buy these old government bonds from insurance companies and pension funds and other such people, and you give them money, what is the most likely thing they're going to buy to replace old bonds? New ones. What does the government want to do? It wants to issue lots of new government bonds. What the government does by buying back government bonds from financial institutions is that it limits the total amount of government bonds there for investors to have. Thus making sure there's enough investors, thus making sure that the demand for your bonds is high enough to sell all of them. So let's say that we've got £700 billion worth of government bonds, right, out there in the market, which is what was the situation in 2008, held by all sorts of different financial institutions. Let's say that you want to issue, over the next 3 or 4 years, £500 billion worth of new bonds. So the total will go from 700 billion to 1,200 billion very quickly. Now, if there's not enough people wanting to buy those bonds at low interest rates, you're going to have to put the interest rates up on those bonds to attract people to want them. So the consequence of trying to issue loads and loads of new government bonds might be that the interest rate you pay on government bonds will go up. This is exactly what happened to Greece and Italy and Spain in the Eurozone. Trick. Why don't we create £400 billion and buy £400 billion worth of old government bonds from financial institutions? So even though we're going to issue another £500 billion worth of government bonds, the total amount of them out there privately is going to be like 300, the 700 minus 400, plus the new ones, which is 500. So the total amount you have to place with investors is now not 1,200 billion, but only 800 billion. That has dramatically reduced the supply of government bonds which you need investors to buy. Thus, making it far more likely you'll be able to place those bonds and avoid a borrowing crisis. There is such a clear and obvious reason to do QE, to buy your own government bonds back, and that is to avoid a debt crisis from the point of view of the government. But does the Bank of England, in its own publication, want to admit that the main reason for conducting this policy was to stop the government going bankrupt? This is a funny door. Anyway, I think we're just about getting there now, aren't we? No problem. So what you have in finance is a very difficult situation to try to master, because the economics of it is more propaganda than reality. The institutions involved in the process are not necessarily wanting to tell you their true motivations. But at the end of the day, if you're in finance, the more you know of what's really happening, the more impressive you look, don't you? Anyway, this is why I like listening to football. It's because it's much more simple than reading about monetary economics, isn't it? You know what I mean? Huh? I mean, like, the monetary economics is interesting, but it's just frustrating because it's so confusing at times. It's probably a bit like being a Man United supporter, working out who's playing.